Welcome to the deep dive.
Okay, let's just jump right in today. We're diving into something that's, well, pretty much front and center for anyone navigating the modern workplace, right?
Yeah.
Employee monitoring.
Oh, yeah, it's a huge area. And, the tech has just sprinted ahead. The law, not so much. It's kind of lagging behind.
Exactly. We've pulled together some sources that give us a really comprehensive look. Everything from the dizzying array of how employers can monitor to the current sort of messy legal picture here in the U.S., and even a structured framework proposed in the material for how we could maybe manage this in a more balanced way.
And we'll definitely weave in some crucial security and compliance bits that pop up in the sources, too, because, collecting all this data, that creates its own set of headaches.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to, well, try and cut through the noise, understand the landscape, what's possible, what the law currently allows.
And what a path forward might look like, keeping those tech realities in mind. Think of it as getting the core knowledge on something most folks, employees and employers, are wrestling with right now.
Okay, let's unpack it.
So when we talk about employee monitoring now, the first thing our sources really hammer home is it's not just one single thing.
Not at all. It's like employers have this massive toolkit, hundreds of different gadgets almost.
That's the picture, yeah. And these tools, they track, broadly speaking, several different kinds of things.
Right. Just tracking what you're doing and how long you spend on it. That's your classic activity and time tracking.
Oh.
Monitoring keyboard and mouse movements.
Uh-huh.
Which apps and websites you're hitting, how productive you seem based on tasks or applications.
And the sources list specifics here. Screen recording, grabbing screenshots, online timesheets, attendance tracking, even detecting if someone's not at their desk.
Yeah, that one's interesting. Then there are tools that feel maybe a bit more invasive, focus more on communications and behavior itself.
Right.
Well, keystroke loading, video surveillance, listening in on phone calls or voicemails, even filtering and watching what you do online or on social media through company networks.
And increasingly, you see monitoring framed under, security and compliance.
Exactly. That's where the sources bring up things like behavior analytics, featured specifically for data breach security, systems for PII masking that's protecting sensitive personal info.
Right, like social security numbers or addresses.
Exactly. And access control, audit trails, detection tools like facial recognition, or even systems flagging multiple people or unknown people near a workstation. Kind of wild.
And location tracking too, right?
Yeah.
GPS, RFID, geofencing.
Yeah, those are big, especially for mobile workforces. But they definitely raise their own privacy flags.
So you've got tools for, everything from checking task efficiency to spotting potential data leaks or verifying who someone is. The sources say the stated goals are things like optimizing performance, improving efficiency, stopping leaks, ensuring compliance, or just, keeping tabs on remote teams.
Which brings us right to that core tension the material really highlights. Employers have real business needs: productivity, security, preventing costly errors or breaches, avoiding liability.
Sure, makes sense.
But employees, they have an expectation, maybe even a right, to some privacy, even at work.
And where does the law stand on that balance today? Our sources paint a picture that's, let's just say, complicated and kind of behind the times. They call it a patchwork.
Patchwork is the perfect word. Trying to apply laws written decades ago to today's digital world. It feels like using a paper map when everyone else has GPS. The main federal law people talk about is the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, ECPA.
Okay, ECPA. And the sources explain the main issue with it, right? It mostly covers communications while they're being sent.
Exactly. In transmission, those seconds, maybe milliseconds, they're actively traveling. Once that email or chat message is just sitting there, saved or stored, the Wiretap Act, part of ECPA, often doesn't apply anymore. Now, the Stored Communications Act part does cover stored data, but it has big exceptions, especially for service providers accessing data to protect their own service or property.
And the employer is often seen as the provider of the company network.
Precisely. So they can often use that exception.
Plus, ECPA has that consent exception, too, if one party consents.
Right. And courts have often said that just using company systems, especially if there's a policy notice, implies consent, or falls under a course of business exception.
So the takeaway from the sources is that ECPA, while it exists, it's just ill-equipped for today's web-based stuff and its exceptions. They tend to favor the employer.
Pretty much, yeah. Especially on company-owned systems.
Okay, what else? There's the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFAA.
Yeah, the CFAA, that's mainly about stopping unauthorized access to computers. Hacking, basically. The sources say it's unlikely to stop an employer monitoring their own systems where employees are authorized to be. It's not really built for that scenario.
Right, makes sense. So federal law is kind of limited. What about states?
Even more of a patchwork there. It's really piecemeal. Some states, like California, have broader privacy rights in their constitutions that can apply to private companies.
Okay.
Others have specific laws just requiring notice of electronic monitoring.
Yeah.
You see that in places like Connecticut, Delaware, New York.
Hmm.
There's been some movement in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, too.
But these laws aren't the same everywhere.
Not at all. They vary widely. And most don't cover all types of monitoring comprehensively. Maybe they ban cameras in locker rooms, but say nothing about, say, tracking your mouse clicks.
Huh. Okay. And then there's common law, that intrusion upon seclusion thing.
Right. That's a tort claim. Sounds serious, as you said.
What does it actually mean?
It takes two things. An intentional intrusion into someone's private affairs or solitude, and that intrusion has to be highly offensive to a reasonable person. The sources bring up the O'Connor v. Ortega case here. It established that your reasonable expectation of privacy at work isn't absolute. It really depends on the specifics.
So, like, are we talking about your private locker versus a shared office computer?
Exactly that kind of thing. Courts are generally more likely to say monitoring employer-provided property work computers, desks, is okay. Especially if there's a policy. It's much harder for an employer to justify searching your personal bag or monitoring you in, say, a restroom.
And getting over that highly offensive bar in court for work-related monitoring, the sources say that's tough.
Very tough, generally. So, yeah, the legal summary from our sources is pretty clear. This patchwork system, it largely favors employers right now, mostly for business and liability reasons. It just hasn't kept up with the technology, and it doesn't give employees strong, consistent privacy protection. The call is definitely for some rebalancing.
Which leads us neatly into that proposed framework one of the sources lays out. It's offered as a way to build that more balanced approach.
Yeah, it's quite structured, based on two core ideas, notice and categorization.
Notice, that seems like...
Yachty.
Yeah, table stakes, right. The absolute baseline.
It really should be. The source calls it low-hanging fruit. Giving clear notice in advance is crucial. It helps head off privacy claims because it lowers the employee's expectation of privacy. It can deter bad behavior. And, frankly, the source argues it's just the right thing to do.
And we're not just talking a one-liner in the employee handbook.
Oh no, far from it. The proposal is pretty detailed. The notice needs to be in plain English, delivered in writing or electronically before monitoring starts, given to everyone, new hires, current staff, reissued regularly.
Wow.
And employees need to acknowledge they got it. Crucially, it has to spell out the types of monitoring used, what kind of info is being gathered.
The reasons why, the frequency, how the data might be used, and even how long it's kept. That's quite transparent.
It's a high standard for transparency, definitely.
Okay, so clear, detailed notice is step one. What about step two, the categorization?
Right, this is where it gets analytical. The framework sorts monitoring practices into 4 buckets. It balances how invasive the practice is, high or low privacy invasion, against how valuable or protective it is for the company, high or low enterprise protection. And it considers the purpose. Is it for general business ops, avoiding liability, or running investigations?
So it's not just good or bad monitoring, it's more nuanced, a spectrum.
Exactly. Category 1 is called best practices, low privacy invasion, high enterprise protection. Now, interestingly, the source defines this category, but doesn't actually list specific examples in it.
Why do you think that is? Maybe too obvious or too context-dependent?
Could be either. Maybe things like basic time clocks or monitoring server uptime. It's a bit unclear. But the idea is these are generally okay for all 3 purposes, unless they're done for some shady reason, like a personal grudge.
Okay. Moving on to category 2. Risky practices.
Yeah, these are high privacy invasion, but also high enterprise protection. This is that gray area we mentioned.
What kind of things fall in here?
Filters and firewalls, monitoring internet use and clickstream data, and checking social media or search engine activity.
Okay, I can see why those are high privacy. You're tracking web habits, maybe looking at personal profiles.
Right. But also high value for the company, blocking bad sites, avoiding liability if someone misuses the network, maybe even checking someone's judgment or character.
So what's the proposed rule for these risky practices?
Broadly allowed for liability avoidance and investigations. Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But restricted for routine business purposes. For that, they have to meet the Privacy Judgment Rule, or PJR.
Ah, the PJR. Okay, remind us what that involves.
Sure. The PJR has 3 parts. 1, The employer needs a reasonable business judgment that the monitoring is actually necessary for that specific business purpose. 2, it has to be narrowly tailored. That means using the least invasive method possible to achieve the goal. And 3, it should target only the relevant employee or employees. No phishing expeditions. It's a critical check.
Using the PJR for risky practices. Yeah, that seems logical, especially with social media monitoring. The sources gave those examples, like the Virgin Atlantic crew fired over Facebook posts, or that guy caught lying about being sick because of a party photo.
Exactly. Those stories show both how powerful this monitoring can be, but also the legal hot water employers can get into if they don't have clear rules and justifications.
Right.
You could easily stumble into discrimination claims, lifestyle discrimination, Title VII, ADA, ADEA, if you misuse that information.
Right. Okay, category 3. Borderline practices. What are these?
These are either low privacy invasion but also low enterprise protection, or they're just legally messy and depend heavily on the specific context.
Examples.
The main ones listed are GPS RFID monitoring and physical searches. For GPS RFID, there isn't a ton of clear legal precedent. It tracks movement, which feels pretty invasive to most people.
Yeah, definitely.
So the framework proposes these must meet the PJR for all 3 monitoring purposes: business, liability avoidance, and investigations.
Wow, so even for just routine business use, like tracking a delivery truck, it still has to pass the PJR test necessary, narrowly tailored, targeted.
That's the proposal. The sources even suggest things like automatically turning off tracking during breaks or lunch, or maybe even working with employees to figure out solutions that meet the need without being overly intrusive.
No, GPS tracking, that's collecting someone's physical location. That's really sensitive data. Must be huge security concerns there.
Oh, absolutely huge. You're collecting sensitive PII, like you said. If that data gets breached, it's not just work routes. It's potentially where someone lives, where they go after work. It's a gold mine for attackers, which is why the sources mention features like data breach security being so important for these platforms.
Okay, so how do those technical features the sources mention help manage the security risks with something like location data?
Well, this is where things like PII masking become critical, being able to hide or obscure the really sensitive parts of that location data unless absolutely necessary. Access control is paramount. Who gets to see this data? Under what conditions? You need really strict rules.
And tracking who looks at it.
Exactly. Audit trails are essential. You need a log of every single access to that sensitive data for accountability. And maybe remediation workflows or automated detection could flag weird access patterns, like someone trying to download large amounts of location data, potentially stopping a breach in progress.
So these tech features aren't just nice to have, they're almost required to make invasive monitoring, like GPS tracking, somewhat defensible security-wise, and to help meet that narrowly tailored PJR standard.
I think that's a fair way to put it, yeah. The policy needs the tech to back it up responsibly, especially with sensitive data. Okay, back to category 3, physical searches. One of the oldest types of monitoring, right? And potentially super invasive.
And legally tricky, like the Ortega case showed. Very context-dependent.
Right. So again, the proposal is it must meet the PJR for all 3 purposes.
Right.
Factors courts include how intrusive it is, where the search happens, office desk versus personal backpack versus locker room.
Whether there was notice, consent, who did the search, why they did it, all that matters.
Exactly. The sources emphasize searching company property like an office is usually more okay than searching personal stuff or private areas.
And some things are just flat out forbidden.
Yes. The framework says no body searches, no searching employee homes, even if they agree there's a Walmart case cited there, no holding employees against their will, and seizing property, very limited, only if there's immediate danger or a clear policy violation and reasonable business judgment, but not for finding, say, booze to send the employee home.
Okay. That leaves category 4, poor practices. High privacy invasion, low enterprise protection.
Right. These are viewed as just too invasive, especially when less intrusive options usually exist. The idea is they should be largely prohibited. This bucket includes desktop monitoring, keystroke monitoring, phone and voicemail monitoring, and video surveillance.
Keystroke logging.
Yeah.
Yeah, that feels incredibly invasive, recording every single thing typed.
It really is. And the sources point out, it might not even be that valuable. A slow typist could be a deep thinker. Someone's workflow might look inefficient to software, but actually work great for them. So the proposed rule here is really strict. Prohibited for business and liability avoidance purposes. Full stop.
Wow. So you can't just use it generally to check productivity or prevent minor policy issues?
According to this framework, no. Only allowed in investigations. And even then, it still has to meet the PJR. There are cases mentioned, like Brahmana and Scarfo, challenging keystroke logging. And think about the backlash when that school district used webcams to secretly take pictures of students at home. People do not like this stuff.
Okay. Same basic rule for phone voicemail monitoring and video surveillance. Prohibited for general use, only for investigations under PJR.
Generally, yes. Prohibited for routine business and liability avoidance. Allowed only in investigations, subject to the PJR. Now, monitoring call duration or numbers dialed, that's usually less problematic legally than actually recording the conversation. And for video, silent video monitoring often gets a pass federally under ECPA, but many states ban it in genuinely private places like restrooms or locker rooms. But overall, these are all seen as practices with really high privacy costs and often limited unique benefits compared to less invasive methods.
So the framework basically creates this tiered structure. It pushes employers toward less invasive tools, or it demands really strong justification and careful tailoring via the PJR for the more invasive ones.
That's the core idea. It acknowledges monitoring happens, but it puts up higher hurdles as the privacy impact goes up.
Okay, pulling this all together. Based on the sources, what are the key recommendations for actually navigating this complex landscape? What's the path forward?
Well, the fundamental point is that the current legal setup just isn't cutting it. It's inadequate. We need a new approach. And this proposed framework offers a potential blueprint for that.
Starting with that mandatory, super clear, upfront notice of everything.
That's the absolute foundation. Then actually using a classification system like best, risky, borderline poor to think critically about different monitoring tools.
And applying those tougher limits, usually involving the privacy judgment rule for the more invasive stuff, especially when it's not for a specific investigation.
Yeah, that PJR is central, demanding proof of necessity, narrow tailoring, and specific targeting.
Yeah.
And just banning those highly invasive, poor practices for day-to-day business or general liability prevention.
And crucially, acknowledging and addressing the security risks that come with collecting all this data, particularly sensitive stuff like location.
Absolutely critical point. The sources make it clear. The policy has to be supported by strong tech security. For things like GPS data, that means best practices are essential, strong access controls, maybe PII masking, detailed audit trails, automated alerts for suspicious activity, all to protect that sensitive employee info from breaches or misuse.
So it's policy and technology working hand in hand. The sources really stress employers needing to use reasonable business judgment and the least invasive methods possible when monitoring is allowed.
Right. And that idea of maybe working with employees on tailoring solutions, particularly for those borderline practices, that suggests a way to build trust, not just impose surveillance from above.
The overall goal, as the sources put it, seems to be finding that tricky balance, walking the fine line between creating efficient workplaces and avoiding excessive invasions of employee privacy.
It's a massive challenge, especially now with work being so digital and often remote.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Our sources paint this picture of technology giving employers this huge suite of monitoring tools.
Yeah.
And the legal system is just struggling to keep pace. It hasn't really figured out how to regulate it all effectively.
And this proposed framework, it offers a way to think about it more systematically. Classify the tools by how invasive they are versus how valuable they are. Demand transparency through really clear notice.
Yeah.
And require that strong justification, the privacy judgment rule, for anything that significantly intrudes on privacy.
And it really highlights that collecting all this data, especially sensitive info like your location, brings a huge responsibility for data security. You need those robust technical safeguards, masking, access controls, auditing to protect that information from ending up in the wrong hands. A data breach can be just as harmful as a privacy violation itself.
Yeah, the security angle is inseparable now. Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting to think about. Consider this. If an employer gives perfect, clear, legally solid notice detailing every single type of monitoring on their systems, the reasons, the usage, the retention, everything. Does an employee using those systems actually retain any meaningful, reasonable expectation of privacy for anything they do on them? Especially now, when work bleeds into personal life, personal spaces, maybe even personal devices. Where do you draw that line?
And what does it do to workplace trust long-term if the answer feels like?
Yeah.
Maybe you don't have any privacy expectation left at all. Definitely something to chew on until the next deep dive.